The Battle of Midway was a major naval battle in the Pacific Ocean. It took place from June 4th to June 7th, 1942. This was only 6 months after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. The battle was fought between the United States Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy. The fighting happened near a tiny American base called Midway Atoll. This small island became the center of a huge and important conflict. The battle was a turning point in the Pacific War. It changed the course of World War II. Before this battle, Japan seemed unstoppable. After this battle, the United States started to gain the upper hand in the long and difficult war. This conflict was unique in many ways. It was a battle fought almost entirely by airplanes. The main ships, the aircraft carriers, never saw each other. Instead, they launched waves of planes to attack their enemies from hundreds of miles away. This new kind of warfare was tested on a massive scale at Midway. The outcome of the battle depended on skill, luck, and intelligence. The American forces were smaller than the Japanese fleet. They were the underdogs in this fight. This made their victory even more remarkable. The story of Midway is a story of bravery, strategy, and the high cost of war. The battle is named after its location, Midway Atoll. This is a small group of islands located about halfway between North America and Asia. The United States controlled this strategic point. It was a vital refueling stop for submarines and a base for patrol planes. For Japan, capturing Midway was a key step in their plan to control the Pacific. They wanted to destroy the American fleet and secure their new empire. For the United States, holding Midway was essential. Losing it would have put Hawaii and even the west coast of the United States in danger. The stakes could not have been higher for both sides. Understanding the Battle of Midway is crucial to understanding World War II in the Pacific. It was more than just a single engagement. It was the moment when the tide of the war began to turn. The battle stopped Japan's expansion across the ocean. It severely weakened the Japanese Navy by sinking 4 of its best aircraft carriers. For the United States, it was a much-needed victory that boosted morale and demonstrated the nation's industrial and military resolve. The events of those few days in June 1942 set the stage for the long and bloody island-hopping campaigns that would eventually lead to Japan's defeat. The Battle of Midway did not happen in a vacuum. It was the result of Japan's military ambitions and its strategy following the attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base in Hawaii. This attack was a stunning success for Japan. It crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleship force. However, it missed a critical target. The American aircraft carriers were not in port that day. They were out at sea on missions. This was a crucial piece of luck for the United States. The Japanese military knew that these carriers were still a major threat to their plans for conquering the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, Japan experienced a series of victories. They conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Their empire expanded rapidly across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy seemed invincible. However, some Japanese leaders were worried. They knew that the United States had immense industrial power. They believed Japan needed to win the war quickly, before America could build up its military strength. The Doolittle Raid. In April 1942, a surprise American bombing raid on Tokyo further convinced them. Though it caused little damage, the raid shocked and embarrassed Japan's leaders. They realized their homeland was vulnerable to attack from American carriers. The main architect of the Midway Plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He was the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet. Yamamoto was the same man who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack. He believed that Japan's only hope for victory was to completely destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He wanted to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle where he could sink them once and for all. He chose Midway Atoll as the bait. His plan was complex. It involved multiple fleets approaching Midway from different directions. The goal was to invade the island and force the American carriers to come out and fight. Yamamoto's plan was very detailed and very large. He assembled the most powerful naval force Japan had ever put to sea. It included 11 battleships, 8 aircraft carriers, and hundreds of other warships and support vessels. The core of his striking force was the Kido Butai, a group of 4 experienced aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the very same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was extremely confident. He believed his plan was foolproof and that the American Navy would be sailing into a trap. He thought victory was certain and that it would force the United States to negotiate for peace. While Japan planned its great attack, the United States had a secret weapon. This weapon was not a ship or a plane. It was a team of brilliant codebreakers working in a basement in Hawaii. This team, known as Station Hypo, was led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. For months they had been working to break the Japanese naval code called JN-25. It was a very difficult and complex code. But slowly, Rochefort and his team began to understand it. They started to read parts of the Japanese military's secret messages. This intelligence work would prove to be one of the most important factors in the American victory. In the spring of 1942, the codebreakers noticed an increase in Japanese radio traffic. The messages mentioned a major upcoming operation. The target was identified only by the code letters AF. Rochefort and his team suspected that AF was Midway Atoll. To confirm this, they devised a clever trick. They had the American forces at Midway send out an unsecured radio message. The message falsely reported that the island's freshwater distillation plant was broken. A few days later, the codebreakers intercepted a Japanese message. It stated that AF was short on fresh water. This confirmed that Midway was the target. This intelligence was a game-changer. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now knew Japan's secret plan. He knew where and when the Japanese would attack. Nimitz was a calm and decisive leader. He had taken command of the Pacific Fleet after the disaster at Pearl Harbor. He had a much smaller force than the Japanese. He had only 3 aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the USS Yorktown. The Yorktown had been badly damaged just a month earlier in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Repair crews in Pearl Harbor worked around the clock to get it ready for battle. They did in 3 days what should have taken 3 months. With the crucial intelligence from Rochefort, Nimitz planned a counter-trap. He knew he could not fight the Japanese on their terms. He had to use his knowledge to his advantage. He sent his 3 carriers and their escort ships to a position northeast of Midway. This spot was carefully chosen. It was a place where they could ambush the Japanese carriers as they approached the island. Nimitz gave command of the carriers at sea to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. These commanders knew they were outnumbered. Their mission was risky, but it was America's best hope to stop the Japanese advance. The battle began in the early morning hours of June 4, 1942. Just as American intelligence had predicted, a wave of Japanese planes took off from their carriers. Their mission was to bomb the American base on Midway Atoll. The force was led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the commander of the Japanese carrier striking force. The Japanese planes arrived over Midway and began their attack. They bombed runways, buildings, and oil tanks. They were met by a small group of American fighter planes based on the island. The American pilots fought bravely, but their planes were old and they were heavily outnumbered. Most were shot down. The attack on the island itself did not go as well as the Japanese had hoped. The American base was damaged, but not destroyed. The runways were still usable. The Japanese flight leader sent a message back to Admiral Nagumo. He recommended that a second attack on the island was needed to finish the job. At this point, Nagumo faced a difficult decision. He had kept half of his planes in reserve. These planes were armed with torpedoes, ready to attack any American ships that might appear. But his scouts had not found any American ships yet. He had to decide whether to rearm the reserve planes with bombs for a second strike on Midway. While Nagumo was considering his options, something unexpected happened. American planes began attacking his fleet. These were not carrier planes. They were torpedo bombers and B-26 bombers that had flown from Midway Atoll. They launched a series of uncoordinated and desperate attacks on the Japanese carriers. These attacks were not successful. The American planes were slow, and they had to fly low and straight to launch their torpedoes. The Japanese Zero fighters, which were fast and agile, shot them down one by one. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. The attack seemed like a complete failure. However, these failed attacks had a very important effect. They convinced Admiral Nagumo that the threat from Midway was greater than he thought. He made a fateful decision. He ordered his crews to rearm the reserve planes with bombs for the second attack on the island. This was a slow and difficult process. The torpedoes had to be taken off the planes, and bombs had to be brought up from the magazines and loaded on. This decision left his carrier decks crowded with planes, fuel lines, and explosive weapons. At this very moment, a Japanese scout plane finally sent a shocking message. American carriers had been spotted to the northeast. Admiral Nagumo was now in a terrible position. He had just received the news he had been waiting for. The American carriers were found, but his own planes were in the middle of being rearmed for an attack on Midway. He had to switch back. The bombs had to be taken off, and torpedoes had to be loaded back on. This created even more chaos and delay on the crowded flight decks of his carriers. The planes returning from the first strike on Midway were also running low on fuel and needed to land. Nagumo decided to recover his returning planes first, then rearm his strike force, and then launch an attack on the American fleet. This decision would cost him dearly. At the same time, the American carriers had launched their own planes. 3 squadrons of torpedo bombers from the carriers Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown found the Japanese fleet first. Just like the planes from Midway, their attack was a disaster. They flew in low and slow without fighter protection. The Japanese Zero fighters swarmed them. Of the 41 American torpedo planes that started the attack, 37 were shot down. Not a single one of their torpedoes hit a Japanese ship. The sacrifice of these brave pilots and their crews seemed to be in vain. It was a horrific loss for the American side. But the sacrifice of the torpedo bomber crews was not in vain. Their desperate, low-level attack had a critical, unintended consequence. It pulled the Japanese Zero fighter planes down to sea level to defend against the torpedo threat. This left the skies high above the Japanese fleet completely unprotected. And at that exact moment, another group of American planes arrived. These were the SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and the USS Yorktown. They had been searching for the Japanese fleet and arrived just as the Zeros were occupied below. They looked down and saw the Japanese carriers, vulnerable and exposed. What happened next is often called the 3 minutes that changed the war. The American dive bombers screamed down from the sky. They dropped their bombs on the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The bombs hit flight decks that were packed with fueled and armed aircraft, as well as unsecured bombs and torpedoes. The explosion set off massive chain reactions. Fires raged out of control. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers were turned into blazing, sinking wrecks. In a stunning reversal of fortune, the core of the Japanese striking force had been wiped out. The tide of the battle had turned dramatically in favor of the United States. The destruction of 3 carriers was a devastating blow, but the battle was not over yet. Japan still had 1 aircraft carrier left in its main striking force, the Hiryu. The commander of the Hiryu's carrier division, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, was a determined and aggressive officer. He quickly organized a counterattack. He launched a wave of dive bombers to find and attack the American fleet. The Japanese pilots soon found one of the American carriers. It was the USS Yorktown, the same ship that had been hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese planes dove in and scored several direct hits. The USS Yorktown was badly damaged. The bombs caused large fires and knocked out its boilers, leaving the ship dead in the water. The crew worked heroically to control the damage. They put out the fires and managed to get the ship moving again, although slowly. Admiral Fletcher, the American task force commander, was forced to transfer his flag from the crippled Yorktown to a cruiser. Despite the damage, it seemed for a moment that the Yorktown might be saved. But Admiral Yamaguchi was not finished. He launched a second wave of planes from the Hiryu, this time armed with torpedoes. The second Japanese attack wave found the Yorktown again. The ship's anti-aircraft gunners put up a fierce defense, but the Japanese pilots pressed their attack with great courage. They managed to hit the Yorktown with 2 torpedoes. This new damage was too much for the already wounded ship. It began to list heavily to one side. The order was given to abandon ship. The crew slid down ropes into the oily water, waiting to be rescued by nearby destroyers. The Yorktown, a symbol of American resilience, was now a helpless, floating wreck. It seemed that Japan had gained a measure of revenge for its own terrible losses. Even as the Yorktown was being abandoned, the American forces were hunting for the last Japanese carrier. Scout planes from the Enterprise and even from the damaged Yorktown had located the Hiryu. Admiral Spruance, now in command of the American carrier forces, ordered an attack. A force of dive bombers, a mix of planes from the Enterprise and Hornet, took off to find the Hiryu. They found it in the late afternoon. They repeated the same kind of devastating attack that had destroyed the other 3 Japanese carriers. The Hiryu was hit by 4 bombs and was soon engulfed in flames. By the end of the day, all 4 of Japan's frontline carriers were sinking or had been sunk. As the sun set on June 4th, the main part of the battle was over. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a catastrophic defeat. 4 of its best aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost forever. These ships were the heart of the Japanese Navy's power. Along with the carriers, Japan lost an experienced heavy cruiser, the Mikuma. More importantly, Japan lost over 250 aircraft. It also lost more than 3,000 men, including many of its most skilled and experienced pilots. These were pilots who had been fighting since the beginning of the war. They were irreplaceable. The loss of these veteran aircrews was a blow from which the Japanese Naval Air Service would never fully recover. The American losses were significant but much smaller in comparison. The United States lost 1 aircraft carrier, the USS Yorktown. It had survived the initial attacks but was later sunk by a Japanese submarine on June 7 while it was being towed back to safety. The destroyer USS Hamon, which was alongside the Yorktown providing assistance, was also sunk by the same submarine. The United States also lost about 150 aircraft, many of which were the obsolete models based on Midway Island. The human cost for the Americans was around 362 men killed. While every loss was a tragedy, the American forces had won a clear and decisive victory against a much larger enemy force. In the days following the main carrier battle, the Japanese fleet was in full retreat. Admiral Yamamoto, who had been far to the rear with his powerful battleships, was too late to join the fight. His grand plan had completely fallen apart. He was forced to accept the defeat and order all of his ships to return to Japan. The planned invasion of Midway Atoll was cancelled. American planes continued to harass the retreating Japanese ships, sinking the cruiser Mikuma. The great Japanese armada, which had set out with such high hopes of a final victory, limped home in disgrace. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility was shattered. The victory at Midway was celebrated across the United States. It was the good news that the American public desperately needed to hear. After 6 months of defeats and bad news, here was a major victory. It showed that the Japanese could be beaten. The morale of the American military and the public soared. The battle also proved the value of aircraft carriers in modern naval warfare. It confirmed that carriers, not battleships, were the new queens of the sea. The outcome of the battle justified the American pre-war focus on carrier aviation and the courage of the leaders who risked their limited forces in this high-stakes gamble. The Battle of Midway was more than just a single victory. It was the strategic turning point of the Pacific War. Before Midway, the Japanese Navy dominated the Pacific Ocean. They had more carriers, more experienced pilots, and a string of victories that made them seem unstoppable. After Midway, the balance of power shifted dramatically. The loss of 4 of their best aircraft carriers was a blow the Japanese could not absorb. Japan's industrial capacity was much smaller than that of the United States. They could not replace these complex warships or their veteran pilots quickly. The initiative in the Pacific now passed from Japan to the United States. With its naval air power severely weakened, Japan could no longer expand its empire. The victory at Midway stopped the Japanese advance in the Central Pacific. It ensured the safety of Hawaii and the American West Coast. It also allowed the United States to go on the offensive for the first time in the war. Just 2 months after Midway, in August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. This marked the beginning of the long and brutal island-hopping campaign. This offensive strategy would have been impossible if the Japanese carrier fleet had not been crippled at Midway. The battle created the opportunity for the Allies to start pushing Japan back. The battle also had a profound psychological impact on both sides. For the Japanese, the defeat was a shock that shattered their confidence. Their leaders tried to hide the true extent of the disaster from the public, and even from many in the military. They knew that the loss was a turning point for the worse. For the Americans, Midway was a massive boost to morale. It proved that the United States could stand up to the Japanese military and win. It gave soldiers, sailors, and citizens at home renewed hope and determination. The victory demonstrated the effectiveness of American technology, intelligence, and fighting spirit. From a naval history perspective, Midway confirmed the supremacy of the aircraft carrier. The great battleships that Admiral Yamamoto had brought to the battle never even fired their main guns at an enemy ship. The battle was decided hundreds of miles away by carrier-based aircraft. This lesson shaped naval strategy for the rest of the war and beyond. The United States, with its huge industrial might, began producing new Essex-class aircraft carriers at an incredible rate. Japan could not keep up. Midway was the high watermark of the Japanese Empire. After this battle, Japan was forced into a defensive war that it could not win. In summary, the Battle of Midway stands as one of the most important naval battles in history. Fought in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean in June 1942, it was a clash that fundamentally altered the course of World War II. It was a battle won by the United States against a superior force, a victory made possible by a combination of factors. The critical element was intelligence. The work of American codebreakers gave Admiral Nimitz the information he needed to set a perfect trap. This intelligence advantage allowed the smaller American fleet to be in the right place at the right time. The battle was also a testament to the courage and sacrifice of the American sailors and airmen. The pilots of the torpedo bomber squadrons, who flew into almost certain death, played a crucial role in the victory. Their sacrifice, though tragic, drew the Japanese fighter cover down, clearing the way for the decisive dive bomber attack. The skill and bravery of the dauntless dive bomber pilots who delivered the fatal blows in just a few short minutes were equally important. And the determined damage control efforts of the crew of the USS Yorktown showed the resilience of the American sailor. Midway was the moment the tide turned against Japan. It stopped their eastward expansion, crippled their naval air power, and allowed the United States to seize the strategic initiative. The loss of 4 frontline carriers and hundreds of elite pilots was a wound from which the Imperial Japanese Navy never recovered. The victory paved the way for the Allied offensive campaigns, starting with Guadalcanal and continuing across the Pacific to the shores of Japan. It was a victory that demonstrated that even in the darkest hours of war, intelligence, courage, and a bit of luck can change history. The legacy of the Battle of Midway endures today. It is remembered as a story of how a nation, reeling from a surprise attack, could rally its forces and achieve a stunning victory. It is studied by military strategists for its lessons on intelligence, risk-taking, and the importance of naval aviation. For the United States, it remains a powerful symbol of American resolve and a tribute to the generation that fought and won the Second World War. The few days of fighting around a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean truly decided the fate of the war in that vast theater.